Hello, this video is on Chapter 11. Chapter 11, the title is Determination of Aggregate Output, the Price Level and Interest Rate. So if I want to give you a background before we move or reorient ourselves what we have done so far and what we are going to do next, remember that we have three major problems or three phenomena to be explained. One is the aggregate output, the behavior of aggregate output, how it's changed. So we can say its growth. And price level and inflation rate. And number three, unemployment rate. So if we are able to explain these three variables, that is the goal of macroeconomic model. So for aggregate output, we use the y variable, and for its growth we usually use G, the percentage change of y. For inflation we used CPI or P. Okay, I write it like this: CPI, Consumer Price Index, or simply let's call it P, Price Index. And its inflation rate was the percentage change of this, so that's we use pi, percentage change of price. And unemployment rate, we just use unemployment rate, right? So that is the number of unemployed divided by total labor force, which is this multiplied by 100. So we know how to measure them, but we are wondering why and how they are changing. In previous chapter, we explained the reason that y may change, assuming that price levels are constant. And the other macroeconomic variables, so macroeconomic variables, we classified them into goods and services market, so A, variables which are goods and services market. So the y variable, the aggregate output, is determined inside the goods and services market, and consumption is a component of aggregate expenditure, and investment, these two as the private sector behavioral functions, and then the government sector behavioral function was government spending and tax. And the book is not talking about it, but the foreign sector is also, we know it from chapter 6 and 7, that export and import are important part of the economy. So just briefly to summarize what we the aggregate output, level of output will, if the market is in equilibrium, should be equal to aggregate expenditure, and the aggregate expenditure is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And for C, we said that Keynes was explaining that A plus B YD. YD in the bracket, I would say YD is equal Y after people are paying the tax. Okay, so this tax is taken out, and what is left over for the private sector is their disposable income, after tax income. And the condition is that the B is always positive and is less than 1, and A is bigger than 0. So I'll wipe them because I need space here for the I. So that was the theory. With the investment of if the price is considered fixed, actually there's only one autonomous investment. But if the price change, that may affect the investment and consumption as well, by the way. There is a segment which, if the prices are fixed and there is equilibrium in money market at the same time, which we are focused on goods and services market. So there is a segment which we skipped it. It's a negative a rate of which people are deciding how much to borrow. If the interest rate, which is the cost of borrowing, is increasing, the people are in the private sector borrowing less, so they are investing less. And if the interest rates drops, they are borrowing more because cost of borrowing is less, and the investment. So this segment we did not discuss, but we can bring it back to our analysis. But because interest rate is something related to factors market, in capital market in particular, so we covered it in chapter 10. We assume that there's no change in this part, and this is fixed, so we have only the autonomous investment in basic Keynesian model. And for them, we said these are discretionary variables, and the government can deliberately change them at any time, and this is according to their budget, government budget, which is tax revenue minus government spending. And these are also, we assumed, it's exogenous. So we make a distinction between exogenous and endogenous variables. So endogenous variables at this simple model is basically the aggregate output and its aggregate income, associated aggregate expenditure. So that was the explaining everything in the goods and services market. There is this variable interest rate here, which is coming from the part B of the economy, and that is basically money market. In money market, we briefly explained the variables which we have. It's money aggregate M1. We equate this as the money supply. Okay, and the money supply is controlled by the central banks, and it's a function of the policy tools which the central bank has in its control. And number one is the required reserve ratio. By playing with the required reserve ratio, they are influencing the money multiplier, and then the commercial banks can give loan and the money supply will increase or decrease. There's yet another one is called discount rate. This is the interest rate which the central banks charge the commercial banks if they borrow as the lender of the last resort from the central bank. So that's also one policy tool. But the most important in welfare states is the open market operation. And this is when the central bank starts buying or selling securities such as government bonds and influence the level of the money supply. And it's has no relation, it has no sensitivity to the interest rate. But the money demand is actually in real term, so we have to divide it by the price, is a function of interest rate and level of income. And we mentioned that there is negative sensitivity of the money demand in real term, that if the interest rate is increasing, then the money demand is decreasing, and if the income is increasing, this is actually positive. And because the price is in the here, the nominal money demand is also has a positive relationship with price, because it's in the, we can say that this write it like this. So the nominal money demand, entire of this multiplied by the price, and if the price is increasing or income is increasing, the money demand, nominal money demand, is increasing, and vice versa. So we see that suddenly we brought the price variable, so price variable, price index, or even inflation is coming, because interest rate, we have nominal interest rate. If we deduct the inflation rate, this is the Fisher equation, we talked about it earlier, equal, so either through this inflation or through this price level, the equilibriums in in money market is going to be, and by the way, the interest rate is coming from the money market. Interest rate is going to be determined in money market. So in goods and services market, we have equilibrium, something like this. The 45-degree line is determining the equation, equilibrium equation, and the aggregate expenditure is like that, and then we would have equilibrium level of income. Okay, if any of the exogenous things change, this is going to be shifting upward or downward, and then the equilibrium may go this way or this way. In money market, we have money supply, because it's function of other things, so it's vertical. If we put the cost of borrowing or the price of holding money here in the vertical axis, and the money supply as the horizontal. The money demand has downward sloping because it's negatively sloped. And then there is going to be equilibrium level of interest rate. Okay, and if the price level change, then there's going to be a shift in the demand. So shift to this may cause interest rate go up or down. All right. So now we have everything to see the interrelationship between the major variables which we have. These are the major variables which we have: output, inflation, and this one we are discussing it in an indirect manner. Okay, so let's talk about how the relationship between Y and P would be. So if the P is changing, in the previous chapter we assumed P is given. Now the question is that what if P is changing, going up or down? What is going to happen to the Y, how it behaves? We say this, there are two parts of it. There's two parts of it. One is the demand side. One is the supply side. How the supply side is interacting, that's called the aggregate supply. How the demand side interacting, we call it aggregate demand. So the model which we are going to talk about, if only bring the price variable or inflation into the picture, the model is, we're using the knowledge which we have developed so far, but the responsiveness of the aggregate output to the price level. So we are after such a model. So the demand side, how it shapes, what is the shape of the aggregate demand and what is the shape of the aggregate supply. So that's what we want to do. And the learning objective of this chapter then is it was better to start from the aggregate demand, but that's no problem. It depends on each textbooks how they structure their narration. Aggregate supply, we first explain, define the aggregate supply and discuss if only price change and everything else remains the same, how it's going to shape. Is it upward sloping or downward sloping or vertical, etc., etc.? And then we move to explain the aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is mixing the equilibrium of the money market and goods market simultaneously. So if the price change, how both markets remains in their equilibrium. It's like interconnected containers that if the price change, if a change in one market happens, there's going to be effect on the other market, and ultimately both markets are going to be in equilibrium. And that is basically explaining the aggregate demand. Okay, so how we can drive the aggregate demand and explain why it's downward sloping. So we are expecting the aggregate demand is downward sloping and the aggregate supply is upward sloping. So that's what we want to do. And then we put them into the equilibrium. So we have Y and P and equilibrium of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. And as a follow-up of this chapter, we will explain a little bit more about the reasons of why aggregate demand is downward sloping. So there are basically three major reasons, and they are explained in this section. And we will also discuss now we bring the labor market into the story. So the indirectly bringing the labor market and to the story, if the labor market has its equilibrium also, and that is called the long run aggregate supply. And these are where all adjustments are taking place. So I forgot to say that here we had a money market, okay, a goods market, but to address the third variable, which is unemployment rate, we are referring to the natural rate of unemployment, that U star, which consists of only frictional plus structural unemployment, and the cyclical unemployment if it is zero. If cyclical unemployment is zero, then if actual unemployment rate is equal, we would say that labor market is in equilibrium. So the labor market, actually it's going to be discussed in the future chapters, and we will not cover it, but indirectly we can say that labor market is referring to the level of output, which we call full employment level of output, if unemployment rate is equal to natural rate of unemployment. And this is fixed. In the long run is fixed. So that is what we call it long run aggregate supply. Long run aggregate supply. So that is also going to be discussed as a follow-up, and then the discussion will be completed, that how all the three variables are explained and interrelationship are elaborated. So let's start with the first learning objective. What do we mean by the determination of aggregate output, price level, and the interest rate? So we are now ready to bring together three pieces of the economy: price level and interest rate and aggregate output, from what we have learned from the previous chapter. This chapter and the next one will give you the ability to think about the key issues policymakers face in trying to manage the economy. So the aggregate supply curve, what is it? The aggregate supply by definition is the total supply of all final goods and services in an economy, and the aggregate supply curve is a graph that shows the relationship between the aggregate quantity of output supplied by all firms in an economy and the overall price. So if the overall price change, how much the aggregate output, the physical in real term output, is going to be increase or decrease. So a better name for the aggregate supply, it's basically price output response curve. Let me explain the aggregate supply in a better way. We had the circular flow diagram. I only picked the part related to the firms. So we have firms, which is the production side of the economy, and they are basically producing this real GDP, and they are dealing with the input markets. Remember, we have labor market, we have capital market, and we have resource market. Okay, and each of these markets have their own equilibrium, but in goods market they would decide if how much they produce as the price is known. So we could say that the entire, this is entire firms, not only one firm, entire economy, all firms will decide to how much to produce if they know about the price index. Having said that, everything else, ceteris paribus, labor market, capital market, and resource market are all that have their own prices. So the labor market has the wage, and capital market is determining the interest, and resource market the rent. And if we multiplied them, you can say that this is basically showing the total cost, and if you multiply these two, it is giving you the total revenue. So, and by the way, they are opting a technology. So most of the variables which is in the as endogenous or exogenous given for the firms, we now have demonstrated in one figure here. And the aggregate supply curve is showing that the responsiveness of y as a function of the price. So if all other things remains the same. So its aggregate supply is actually the short run aggregate supply. We should say this is a short run because we are assuming that the wage are fixed, interest and rents are all fixed, and also the technology is fixed. And the only thing which we are going to think of, if the price goes up, what is going to happen to the y, and if the price goes down, what is going to happen to the output. So we would say that if they are following the profit maximization behavior of total revenue minus total cost, if these are fixed, and by the way, the labor market is going to be one of the key factors in these decisions, and we are assuming that equilibrium, the only variable cost is the labor. This may vary, but these are considered as the fixed cost. So they've already been magnitudes, the capital or infrastructures are not going to change significantly. They are being decided in a longer spectrum, and there is a sunk cost which it's been trapped. It's already been locked decision. The only thing is that may vary is this, but we assume that the wage is not going to change. That is very sticky, and it's sticky wages. So because we are not going to go too much into the labor market, for the time being, we say that the ceteris paribus means that the wages are fixed. We could say that these are also fixed, but the variable cost in producing this is going to be the labor, and through the hiring or firing the labor, not the changes in the wages. And the other two is almost are less affecting the short run level of output. So if the price goes up, the total revenue is going to go up, so the profit will increase. So it means that they should actually produce more, so the y will go up. So there is a positive relationship between them. So if we want to say that y is a function of p, and it's going to be positive. And this analysis is the short run. And if we draw it, it shows the responsiveness of the aggregate output from the firm's perspective to the price is a positively sloped. Actually, we can draw it like this, and there's a reason for that. That if we have produced nothing, if it is starting from zero, a small change, a epsilon change in the price, we're going to create, it's very elastic, we're going to create a lot of production, because simply we can hire more laborers and produce more and more. But there is a vertical side, and that is that actually we have a limit. We have a limit. If we are producing Ymax is that we have already hired entire labor force. So this L, which is coming here, I should rewrite it here clearly, consists of that labor force, consists of U plus E. So let's rename it as a labor employed, and this one labor unemployed. Together is making labor force. And this is actually labor employed. And if the labor employed is starting from zero, if we add more, wage is not going to change, and then we can actually increase this rapidly. So here we have 100% employed. So it means that labor employed is equal labor force. And here is labor employed is equal 0. It means that labor force consists of labor unemployed. So here the unemployment rate is 100%. Here the unemployment rate is 0%. So it's the unemployment rate here is 100%, and here is 0%, and the unemployment rate is varying between these ones. So we would say that if we have plenty of labor force available, it's going to be flat side of the short run aggregate supply, and then it's going to be a positively sloped, and then there is going to be a vertical, because it doesn't matter that once you're hiring your entire labor force, no matter what is the price, we're not going to create more than this. So it's becoming entirely inelastic aggregate supply. Here is perfectly elastic aggregate supply. So from the microeconomics, if you wish, and here is relatively elastic or positively sloped. So we would know that Y, if it is a function of P, the aggregate supply, this is going to be positively sloped. So that is what the book is explaining. It says that aggregate supply is actually a price output response curve. A curve that traces the output price decision given the price level under the different levels of aggregate demand. So the shape would be like this. In the short run, if everything else remains the same, and the equilibrium level of wage, equilibrium level of interest, equilibrium level of rents are given and are exogenous, and the moment the price level picks up, the aggregate supply by all firms are going to be positively responding to the price level. So that is the a low level of aggregate output. It's fairly flat because the unemployment rate, if unemployment rate is very high, the firms can actually quickly hire no matter how much amount and can produce more and more. So it's very flat side, is very elastic. As economy approaches the capacity or the maximum capacity of the economy, then the aggregate supply turns to become vertical. So this is at capacity, or YY here constant is the vertical side of the economy. So why it's upward sloping? It is because wage is a considerable fraction of the total cost in the input side, and wages also is not going to change instantly with the change of the prices. So you may say that why are you thinking like that the wages, if the price change, the labor market is going to affect and the wages starts changing. That's very true, but we call that as the long run aggregate supply. If the wages get adjusted with the changes of the prices, we would say that some of the ceteris paribus things has changed. So we consider if the wages change, it's going to be a shift in the short run aggregate supply, and we're going to demonstrate that one. Okay. So wages are a large fraction of total cost, and wages change lag behind price change. So this lag is because of the short run analysis. So we assume that the wages are not going to change instantly as the price changes. And as a result of that, it means that the cost side does not change, but the revenue side has increased. So the output starts increasing. This gives us an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. Why it's got this particular shape? It's basically the vertical side is where the labor market is, employed labor is entirely equal to the entire labor force, and then no matter how much the price is increasing, the output cannot increase. So that's the vertical side. And at low output level, as the curve is AS curve is flatter, because there's a large army of unemployed people out there, and if the wages are fixed, basically the firms with a little bit slight change of the price, they can hire and make a good profit, and that's why it's a more flat or more horizontal shape. And the discussion of the changes in the aggregate supply. So we would say that the aggregate supply curve is such a shape, and if the price change, then Y is moving alongside the curve. So we can move upside or maybe sometimes downward. So moving along aggregate supply. Now if other things change, if other factors, what would be the other factors according to the diagram which I showed? It was wages, if the wages change, or interest or the rent, so input prices change, or technology change, or natural disasters. So these are exogenous variables, which we assume they're constant. So we were moving alongside. If we are here, point A, if only price change, we can go upward or downward like this. But if this change, what will happen if the input prices increase? If the input prices increase, this is shifting to the left. If the input price goes down, it is shifting to the right. If the technology is improving, we are shifting to the right. And usually the technologies, we don't downgrade our technology, but that is also possible if a war happens or technology downgrade of the technology may cause a negative shift to the left. And natural disaster, if an earthquake comes or a Hurricane Katrina hits the US economy in Florida, the aggregate supply is shifting to the left. Or sometimes the natural blessing may happening. A good rainfall, the agriculture sector, so the aggregate supply is increasing. In terms of the resources, maybe resources or rent, the oil is an important input to the oil consuming economy. So if the oil price is increasing, shift is to the left side. So what happened in 1970s was a shift of the aggregate supply. Because oil price becomes more expensive, the aggregate supply shift to the left. So this is basically explaining the shocks, or it can be explained like this. Okay, so aggregate supply entirely shift to the left if these factors change, leftward shift, for example, an increase in the wage rate or energy prices or the oil prices. This may happen. And these are technology improvement, advanced technology, or maybe wages become cheaper. If the wages become cheaper, this is shifting to the right. So that is explaining a lot. And the long-run aggregate supply is after these shifts are settled, and what would be the equilibrium output. And we are describing the long-run aggregate supply towards the end of this chapter. Okay, so we have explained everything about the aggregate supply. Now we move to the aggregate demand. So that is going to be the next video. Thank you.